What's going on, guys? So today's video is kind of a follow-up video to a video that I posted a little while back where I talked about the things that I look for whenever I'm touring an RV, both on the outside and the inside, and it was two separate videos that I did. So definitely go back and check those out, because this, again, is kind of a follow-up video to those, because I got a lot of comments from folks asking me why I didn't look at this or why I didn't look at that. So let's talk about that. Hang tight, I'll be right back. And yes, I know the grass needs to get mowed. We just sprayed all this with more weed killer. Hopefully it knocks out the grass. It's grass and weed killer. But back to the topic. So when I did that walk around, I talked about a lot of different things, but there were some things that I didn't focus on that some folks thought I would typically focus on. And let's talk about some of those. So the first one is I didn't mention the slide system. So the reason why I didn't mention the slide system is actually kind of calculated. First of all, whenever you look at RVs, typically most manufacturers put the right type of slide system for the application. And the reason why they do that is because the manufacturer of the slide system won't support claims if it was used improperly, or in the most part they won't. Sometimes they will, sometimes it falls on the RV manufacturer and not necessarily the manufacturer of the slide out system. That said, I do definitely prefer rack and pinion slides where applicable, where you can use them. There are some scenarios where you just can't use them just because you're physically limited by how the RV is built. For instance, you're never really going to see a rack and pinion slide elevated off of the ground or higher than the frame and used in like an overhang of a fifth wheel, mainly because a rack and pinion style slide has arms that go through the actual frame rail, and sometimes they're called through frame slide out systems because the arms actually retract and extend from holes that are cut into the RV frame itself. Now, the reason why I prefer the traditional rack and pinion system is simply because it tends to be a more robust system. It tends to be able to handle weight better. It tends to be able to handle more rigorous use better because it's simply supported through the frame and not the sidewall of the RV. When you see things like Schwintek slides or cable-driven slides, a lot of people don't realize that the slide wall itself is actually suspended by the wall of your RV, so it puts a lot of stress on those components. And the other thing that can potentially happen is if you have something blocking it, it can actually damage the sidewall, again, because it's torquing that force against the sidewall and not the frame. And you typically won't have those issues with a rack and pinion slide system. Plus, if a rack and pinion slide system were to have some type of an electrical issue or mechanical issue, there's usually some means to retracting or extending the slide in an emergency if you need to. So this was one of those scenarios I really should have talked about in the video. And yes, I absolutely prefer rack and pinion. Next in line for me would be Schwintek. And I know there are some new slide manufacturers that are on the market and they give you the ability to do some things that Schwintek doesn't. But by and large, the vast majority of the RVs you see are going to be either a Schwintek, a rack and pinion, or a cable-driven slide system. Cable-driven slide is like my least favorite. I'm not a big fan of it. I understand why they make it. I understand why it's designed the way it is, but from a long-term reliability perspective, I'm just not a big fan of it. However, brands like DRV have been using cable-driven slides in their bedroom slides for some time. I think they work fine on your smaller, lighter slides, but I just don't prefer seeing them on your larger, deeper slides. Okay, so the second one was the roof material. Why I don't talk about the roof material very much. Well, this is actually one of those areas in RV construction that is significantly improved in just the past 5 to 10 years. The materials that they're now using are far more resistant to UV. They're far more resistant to damage that could have impacted a roof material in the past. And the biggest one is discoloration and the fact that sometimes you get this bleeding effect where the dye or the actual roofing material creates these black streaks coming down the side of your RV. And almost regardless of the type of material that they use on modern RVs, you really don't get that chalking effect. You don't get that black streaking effect anymore. And quite frankly, most of the materials are pretty dang resilient over a long period of time as long as it's not damaged and it was installed properly. If the manufacturer of your RV does not install the roofing material properly, then you can have huge issues. You can have leaking issues, you can have tearing issues, you can have all sorts of different issues that just really can damage the entire RV if it's not properly installed from the factory. So one of the things that's important to me, and it's more important than really the type of material that's used, it's how it was installed. And also, here's a big one: the crew that installed it, how much experience do they have installing it? One of the things that was really refreshing about Coachman is when I worked with them and collaborated on the Brookstone, I talked to the actual manufacturer of the roofing material. And they told me every time they go to the Coachman factory, it's the same crew that's been installing roofs for like the past 15 years. So they don't have this turnover where they have to constantly train new people on how to deal with roofing material and how to install it properly. They have the same crew that's been doing it over and over and over. And I would say that's probably the single most important area to have experienced employees working. And in many cases, because of COVID, because of all the other excuses that occur, they did not have those people. So some RV manufacturers were forced to kind of train on the fly and get people to be able to install the roofing material. And who knows if there were little things that were missed? Who knows if the adhesive wasn't applied properly, or if they didn't seal it around the edge properly, or perhaps it wasn't stretched properly, or perhaps they didn't seal a hole that was drilled through it when they mounted an air conditioning unit or a vent or something else. So really, the material that they use up top is less important to me than how it was installed. And here's the big one: what you do with your RV. Let me give you an example. Way back here, these trees, when you pull the RV through, if you're not careful, you're going to scrub some of these lower branches right here. And you may not think it's that big of a deal, but some branches have some pretty sharp spikes in them, some thorns in them. Some branches have some pretty rough branches, and they're harder than you think, and they can scratch and possibly tear the roofing material. I know a lot of folks that travel around the country will go to an RV resort and they really want the area with all the trees and all the foliage over top, especially if you go to Florida or Alabama or Georgia where there's a lot of pine trees. You may be in a park where there's pine cones falling on your RV, and you may not think about it as something that could damage the roof material, but all it takes is a tiny little puncture for water to be able to penetrate in and damage it. Now, what I like about some materials is that it's adhered front to back. So there's no area where there's not glue underneath it. So even if you get a small puncture, in many cases, that puncture is not going to lead to any type of delamination or water intrusion simply because it's essentially sealed off. You might get a little damage in that one little area, but for the most part, it shouldn't spread very far. But this is why it is absolutely imperative that if you own an RV, you look on top of it. Some RVs don't have walkable roofs, so you want to get a ladder and stand next to it. Or if you have a walkable roof, get on top of your RV, get a ladder on the side of it, find some way to look at the top of your RV very closely and look for little imperfections, look for things that may have been damaged. I mean, shoot, you get a big enough bird up there pecking at something on top of it, it can probably puncture it. Things that you may not think about can happen to your RV simply because you didn't know that that thing could happen. Again, a pine cone falling on it, bird pecking on it, tree limb scratching against the top of it. Maybe a rock from a vehicle that was slung out went over your vehicle and actually hit the top of your RV and potentially caused some type of damage. Now, I'm not going to say that the material is so thin that any little thing is going to damage it, but there are, on occasions, things that can damage your roof that you probably just aren't that familiar with. So things that can damage your roof are very important to keep an eye on, to stay away from. And if you can't stay away from them, if that one RV spot that you're at just happens to be under a tree and you have stuff falling on your RV, then it's critical that you inspect the roof of your RV and you be prepared to do small little fixes, small little things to help prevent little things from becoming big things. And then the final topic was axles. You know, this is a topic that I've probably gone over 20 to 30 plus times individually in their own videos, but probably hundreds of times during my RV review videos. A lot of folks are really against the type of axles manufacturers put on RVs because they think they are underrated. A lot of people believe that the axles should be able to at least meet the gross vehicle weight rating of the RV. So for instance, we have a 17,500 pound gross vehicle weight rating and we're running 8,000 pound axles. So we only have 16,000 pounds worth of axle capacity supporting the RV. And then, you know, tires, which is its whole other topic. But you guys know me, I'm always big on overkill on the tires, mainly because that's actually what's physically touching the ground and what's rolling. So I'm a big advocate to go overkill on your tires. But what I want to talk about here is the same thing that I've repeated time and time again. I did a really good job of it in the Vanley Beacon video whenever we got it, where I talked about the 8,000 pound axles on, you know, roughly an 18,000 pound RV. So Whenever you have 7,000 pound axles, which is the most common axle you're going to see on most fifth wheels, on an RV with a GVWR of, let's say, 16,000 pounds, well, that means you have 14,000 pounds worth of axle capacity. Why would a manufacturer risk it? Why would a manufacturer put 14,000 pounds worth of axle capacity on an RV that weighs 16,000 pounds when fully loaded? Well, it's the same reason why your pickup truck has a front axle and a rear axle. Neither axle is designed to carry the entire load of the vehicle. That's why you have a front axle. Your rear axle is only designed to be able to carry what's over it, the weight that's specifically going to be transferred to it. So when you talk about the transfer of pin weight in an RV, if you have a 16,000 pound GVWR trailer, which is the trailer completely loaded up to capacity, and you're transferring roughly 3,000 of that pounds to the truck itself, that means you actually have about 13,000 pounds that would ever be resting on the axles. Now, that being said, most people try not to load their RV up to complete weight. And what I mean by that is you empty out your tanks. You don't have, 2,000 pounds worth of water resting inside of all of your holding tanks. You typically are going to have about 1,000 pounds worth of supplies inside of your RV. So let's say your 16,000 pound RV fully loaded weighs 13,000 pounds when it's empty. You got roughly 3,000 pounds worth of cargo capacity. If you transfer, let's say, roughly 2,500 pounds to the back of your vehicle, then that means you're really only going to have maybe about 11,500 pounds resting on the actual axles. So 14,000 pounds worth of axle capacity is generally going to be more than enough for most RVs, even upwards of 16,000 pounds GVWR. Now, of course, your payload rating, the weight of your RV dry, as well as where you position stuff is all going to play into that. But I would venture to say that if you actually weigh your RV and you're not full timing it and just loading every possible thing inside your RV, and you don't have full tanks and you don't have, so much capacity just statically sitting in there all the time, even if you have two 7,000 pound axles and you have a very heavy RV, at any given time, if you go to a truck scale, you're probably only going to have upwards of maybe 11, 12, maybe 13,000 pounds on the axles at any given time. And that's if you're maxing it out. That's if you're really pushing it. So just keep in mind that even though, there's a lot of folks who really think, man, the axle capacity of the RV should be able to support the weight of the entire RV, what you're not realizing is if you look at it right here, the front landing gear, the front jacks right there on this RV are probably supporting about 2,500 pounds. These would be the front wheels right now. When you hook this up to a truck, the back axle of your truck now becomes the front axle of your RV. So think about it that way. If this is a pickup truck, these are your back tires. Your front tire is going to be the back tire of your truck. So that's why it's so important to understand what your weight ratings are, where weight is, where you position it, and how much weight is actually resting on the axles. Because again, just like a pickup truck, you have a front axle and a rear axle. On a trailer, this is just actually your rear axle. Your front axle is the vehicle that you're towing it with. Anyways, guys, I sure hope that this video has been informative. I can miss things sometimes. Sometimes I don't talk about things that are really important. Sometimes I try to touch on something for so long that I miss something else that would normally be really important, like the slide-out system. Guys, I sure hope you've enjoyed this video. If you haven't had a chance, please take a moment, subscribe to my channel, give me a thumbs up, and we'll talk to you again very soon.